An undercover black FBI agent gets tied to a pole by white cops. But then he did something that will shock you.
It was just before lunchtime on a weekday, the type of hour when downtown Broad Street was usually alive with chatter and foot traffic. Office workers strolled in search of cheap takeout. Students from the local community college lingered outside a cafe, sipping iced drinks under the mild spring sun. Nobody suspected that something explosive, something terrible and deeply unjust, was about to unfold right in the open. Marcus Avery, a young black FBI agent working undercover, blended into the crowd like any other passerby. He wore faded jeans, a plain gray t-shirt, and battered sneakers. He looked like a regular guy running errands, but inside he was on high alert. For several weeks now, he had been digging into reports of racially motivated misconduct among a small group of local police officers. These officers were rumored to abuse their power for their own amusement, harassing people of color in plain view, counting on fear and complicity to shield them from consequences. The FBI needed hard evidence. That's why Marcus had been assigned this risky mission. Tucked in the fabric of his t-shirt was a hidden micro camera, transmitting a silent, encrypted live feed to a team of federal agents stationed in a utility van 3 blocks over. His supervisor, Janet Ruiz, would be watching. They had tested the camera thoroughly. Marcus knew it would show everything: the faces of the crooked officers, their voices, their actions. The plan was to let them incriminate themselves. Marcus would simply be the bait, an innocent-looking target they'd be tempted to abuse. He adjusted his pace, walking slowly along Broad Street. A black and white cruiser rolled into view from a side street, moving slowly. Marcus spotted 2 white officers inside. Perfect match. Officers Brody Wheeler and Keith Dawson. He knew their records by heart. Multiple complaints had been filed against them for roughing up young black men, taunting them with slurs, sometimes even publicly humiliating them. Internal affairs never pinned them down due to lack of credible evidence. That ended today. The squad car slowed near the curb where Marcus walked. He kept his eyes forward, as if lost in thought. He felt the car's presence like a shark circling a lone swimmer. The engine idled loudly. People on the sidewalk glanced over but kept going. Why confront the police? Most wanted to avoid trouble. "Hey you," a voice barked. Marcus turned to see Officer Wheeler leaning out the passenger window, sunglasses low on his nose. "Come here a second." Marcus hesitated, feigning nervous confusion. "Me? Is something wrong, officer?" Dawson, the driver, smirked. "Don't get smart. Come here." Marcus approached the car, keeping his hands visible at his sides. He knew from the complaints that these cops were quick to claim resistance if their targets looked even slightly nervous. Wheeler looked Marcus up and down. "What's your name?" "James," Marcus lied smoothly, using his assigned alias, James Palmer. "Got ID, James?" Dawson asked, eyes narrowing. Marcus shook his head. "I just stepped out for a quick walk. I live nearby." Wheeler snorted. "Just stepped out? Huh. Dressed like that?" He gestured vaguely at Marcus's simple clothes, as if they were suspicious. "Why you hanging around here?" "Just buying lunch," Marcus answered, keeping his tone easy. He even pointed at a sandwich shop across the street. "I was heading that way." Dawson tapped the steering wheel. "I think we should check him out. Never know what these guys are up to." Marcus caught the emphasis. "These guys." He played along, acting unsettled. "Is there a problem, officers?" Wheeler opened the car door and got out. He towered over Marcus, folding his arms. "Problem? We'll see." He glanced at passersby, clearly enjoying being on display. People slowed down, curious. They sensed tension but didn't intervene. No one wanted to be the hero and end up in handcuffs themselves. Dawson stepped out too. He was shorter, stockier, with a shaved head. He gave Marcus a once-over. "Hands on the car," he ordered, pulling out a notepad as if going through the motions. Marcus obeyed silently, resting his palms on the hood of the cruiser. The metal felt warm from the sun. He could sense pedestrians whispering among themselves. A few took out their phones to record. Good. The more witnesses, the better. Marcus knew not all of them would stick around, but maybe their videos would back up the official feed. He had to appear helpless and non-threatening. Wheeler frisked him roughly, slapping at his pockets. "No ID." "That's suspicious," he said loudly, making sure everyone around heard him. "We got ourselves a troublemaker." Marcus bit his tongue. They were performing, putting on a show of dominance and intimidation. He knew they wanted to see fear. Instead, he tried to look uncertain, as if unsure why this was happening. The bystanders looked on, some frowning, others shaking their heads. A couple muttered quietly, "This is messed up." but no one stepped forward. Wheeler circled in front of Marcus, removing his sunglasses to lock eyes. "You know," he began in a low voice that carried across the sidewalk, "you people need to learn to follow rules. Hanging around like you own the place, making folks nervous." He paused for effect, watching Marcus closely. Marcus's heart clenched. They were playing right into the narrative he needed. He didn't flinch. "Officer, I was just walking to get lunch." Dawson moved closer, grinning. "Ah, he was just walking. Sure, that's what they all say. Maybe you were planning something. Robbing a store? Selling something?" People in the crowd started murmuring louder. "What's he done?" called a middle-aged woman, clutching a shopping bag. The officers ignored her. Marcus caught the racial undertone. His type, meaning a black man in a predominantly white neighborhood. He felt a surge of anger but kept his face neutral. Inside his t-shirt, the camera was recording everything. Their words, their tones, the crowd's reactions. Dawson suddenly pushed Marcus back against the car. "You not gonna talk? Fine. Let's see how you like a little reminder of who's in charge." He eyed Wheeler conspiratorially. "Maybe show him off to everyone. Let him know what happens when you wander where you don't belong." Marcus's throat tightened. They were escalating. He had expected this to happen in a quiet corner, but they were brazen enough to do it on Broad Street, in front of midday pedestrians. This was good for the case, terrible for Marcus. He braced himself for what came next. Wheeler's smirk curled. "Hold him." Dawson gripped Marcus's arms from behind, twisting them painfully. Marcus grimaced. He couldn't break character. He had to seem just like a random citizen. If he showed combat skill, they might suspect something. He let Dawson force him down to the pavement. Gravel bit into his knees. More onlookers started shouting. Wheeler pulled a length of plastic zip ties from his belt. Not standard handcuffs, just cheap restraints often used for mass arrests or improvised situations. He tied Marcus's wrists together and then forced him back up to standing. Dawson pointed to a signpost nearby, an old metal pole with parking restrictions and faded notices stuck to it. "There's a nice pole right there," he said, chuckling. "We'll put him on display." Marcus's stomach dropped. They were going to tie him to a pole out in the open just to humiliate him. His mind flashed to the camera feed. Ruiz and the rest of the FBI team must be fuming, watching all this. He needed to endure this a bit longer to ensure the evidence was crystal clear. The officers dragged Marcus over to the pole. He stumbled, pretending to resist just enough to look natural. Dawson pressed Marcus against it while Wheeler looped more zip ties around him and the pole, binding his upper arms and chest so he couldn't move. A hush fell over the crowd. People looked horrified. A few tried to record it, aiming their phones at the scene. Some pedestrians hurried away, afraid to confront the cops. Wheeler stepped back to admire their handiwork, grinning like he'd just hung a piece of art. "That's what happens," he called loudly, making sure the crowd heard, "when you don't show respect around here." He turned to Marcus, voice dropping low. "How do you like the view, huh?" Marcus glared straight ahead, pretending shock and embarrassment. In truth, he was furious, but he had to keep calm. Dawson smirked. "Look at him, all tied up. Nothing to say now, huh?" He leaned closer and added softly, but still audibly enough to catch on camera, "You think your color gives you a pass? Not here. We're the law on this street." That was it, the direct mention of race. The hateful attitude laid bare. Marcus felt a surge of righteous anger. He knew they had what they needed. Still, he had to stay in character. He tried to tug at the restraints, making it seem like futile resistance. "This is illegal," he said, voice shaking. "I didn't do anything wrong." Dawson checked his watch. "You know, maybe we'll take a walk and come back later. See if he learns his lesson." He said it casually, as if leaving a dog tied to a post. Wheeler nodded, giving Marcus a condescending pat on the shoulder. "Now don't run away," he mocked, making a show of walking back to their cruiser, which was still parked in plain sight. He turned to the crowd. "And all of you, mind your business. This doesn't concern you." A few people shouted back, "This is wrong," but the officers ignored them. More phones raised in the crowd, capturing this surreal scene. Marcus's cheeks burned, not just from the sun, but from the humiliation. He was a federal agent, a man who had sworn to uphold the law. Now he stood tied to a pole, treated like a street thug, with random strangers gaping at him. His entire body ached with tension. But inside that ache was purpose. They'd walked right into his trap, on live feed, no less. Dawson called out to Wheeler, "Let's go do a round and see if any other trouble is brewing. We'll check back on him." With that, both officers climbed back into their cruiser and drove off at a leisurely pace, leaving Marcus bound and helpless. The crowd parted, some following the cruiser at a distance, some staying near Marcus to see if they could help. A brave older woman approached carefully. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, eyes filled with concern. Marcus forced a shaky nod. Could someone call the news or something? He played the role of a scared victim, hoping to draw more attention. "I'm filming this," said a young man holding his phone steady. "This is unbelievable. We have to let people know." Marcus felt some relief. The public was outraged. Combined with the official FBI footage, these cops wouldn't have a chance to wiggle out with fake reports or cover-ups. Still, he needed rescue. His team must have seen everything. They'd pinpoint his location. The plan was for them to come in after they got enough evidence. He figured they must have way more than enough by now. He tugged at the ties, feigning desperation. Inside, he counted the seconds. Maybe in a few minutes, an unmarked FBI car would swoop in. Or maybe they'd send uniformed officers from a different precinct, good cops who weren't in on the corruption. The crowd grew bolder now that the main threat was gone. Someone tried to pry at the zip ties with keys. Another tried to reassure him they'd get him free. Marcus thanked them, acting relieved. He couldn't tell them who he really was. Not yet. This was far from over, and revealing himself could jeopardize the operation. He looked at the concerned faces gathered around him and mustered a small, reassuring smile. "Thank you," he said quietly, because even if they didn't know the whole story, their empathy mattered. And so, beneath the midday sun, Marcus Avery waited, tied up, humiliated, but not broken. He waited for the reckoning that was sure to come. Around him, the crowd had grown. 10 or 15 people lingered, unsure whether to step in or wait for official help. Phones were still pointed in his direction, but now a few voices tried to comfort him. Meanwhile, just beyond the immediate circle of onlookers, a familiar figure observed the scene quietly. FBI Supervisor Janet Ruiz. She had slipped into the crowd wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap, blending in like any concerned bystander. She kept her distance for now. Marcus didn't notice her. He was focused on not giving himself away. Ruiz, however, could see his trembling arms and clenched jaw, signs that he was under enormous stress. She knew better than to rush in guns blazing. The FBI's goal was to catch every last one of these crooked cops, and that required patience. Still, her gut twisted watching Marcus suffer. The camera inside Marcus's shirt continued transmitting. In a cramped van parked several blocks away, 2 agents monitored the feed. One tapped the microphone at his collar, whispering to Ruiz through a hidden earpiece, "We're getting everything. Perfect audio, but we need those officers to return. Right now, we got assault, false arrest, and public humiliation on record, but headquarters wants them fully nailed, preferably a confession or direct mention of their patterns." Ruiz didn't reply aloud, just gave a subtle nod. She knew what the higher-ups wanted, something that would bury these perpetrators so deep they'd never see the light of day. She also knew how risky it was to wait. Marcus was alone out there, tied up like an exhibit of cruelty. The tension tightened in her chest. She had to trust Marcus's instincts and their plan, at least for a little longer. After maybe 10 minutes, the black and white cruiser reappeared, cruising slowly up the street as if on a casual patrol. The atmosphere changed instantly. People began shouting at the car before it even stopped. "What do you think you're doing?" Someone yelled. Another demanded, "Untie him." Marcus steadied his breathing. This was the moment. He prayed the officers would say something incriminating enough to seal their fate once and for all. The squad car pulled over. Officers Wheeler and Dawson stepped out, looking surprised at the crowd's defiance. Wheeler raised his hands mockingly. "Wow, look at this. A fan club," he said, strolling toward Marcus with exaggerated calm. Dawson stayed a few steps behind, scanning the faces. He seemed annoyed by the phones pointed at them. Wheeler's gaze fell on Marcus. "You still here?" he asked, as if expecting him to have vanished into thin air. Then, in a louder voice so everyone could hear, "Now, why are all you people making such a fuss?" "We're just keeping the streets safe." A burst of indignation rippled through the crowd. "Safe from what?" shouted a student holding her phone steady. "He didn't do anything." Wheeler gave a theatrical shrug. "So he says, but we know how certain types operate. Better to keep a close watch." He put extra emphasis on certain types, drawing angry murmurs from the bystanders. Marcus kept silent, letting the officer's words hang in the air. The tension worked in his favor. He noticed Ruiz at the edge of his vision, standing calmly with folded arms. Good. Help was near. Dawson stepped forward, glaring at the crowd. "Everyone back up. This is official police business. When nobody moved, he puffed out his chest, trying to intimidate them. I said, "Back up." A few people retreated a step or two, but most held their ground. The man in the suit, voice trembling with anger, said, "You can't leave him tied up like this. It's illegal." Wheeler turned slowly, his eyes narrowing. "Illegal? I see a suspicious individual, I detain him. Simple as that." He stepped closer to Marcus, giving the zip ties a playful flick. "Unless, of course, he'd like to talk. Maybe tell us why he's here." Marcus took a steadying breath and decided to push them further. He needed them to confirm their twisted motives plainly. "I told you I was just walking. I have rights." "You can't do this," he said, trying to sound both scared and indignant. Wheeler laughed. "Rights?" He glanced at Dawson, smirking. "He thinks he has rights." Marcus could feel the intensity rising. If the officers got spooked, they might attempt something worse. Or they could untie him and vanish before official backup arrived. He shifted slightly, letting the camera catch Wheeler's face at a clear angle. Dawson ran a hand over his shaved head, his voice quieter but still audible. "Look, we can't stay here forever. Too many eyes." He nodded at the crowd. Wheeler glanced around, a scowl forming. "All right," he said, stepping closer to Marcus again. "You want out? Fine, but first, an apology." Marcus tilted his head, confused. "Apology? For what?" "For wasting our time," Wheeler spat. "For thinking you could stroll through here like you own the place." Dawson chuckled bitterly. "And for making a scene, drawing this crowd. We're in charge here, not you." The crowd erupted with objections. Ruiz took a subtle step forward, careful not to blow her cover yet. She listened as the officers dug their own grave. Marcus stayed focused. "I'm not apologizing for existing," he said firmly, letting righteous anger slip into his voice. "This is wrong, and you know it." Wheeler's eyes flashed. He reached forward and grabbed Marcus's chin roughly, forcing him to look straight into his eyes. "Watch your tone," he hissed. Then he raised his voice again, speaking to the crowd as if giving a lesson. "You all see what happens when certain people forget their place. We have to remind them." More recording phones lifted. Someone shouted, "You're done." People are watching. Another yelled, "This will go viral." Dawson sneered at the phones. "Post all you want. We know how to handle reports, don't we, Wheeler?" He sounded confident, too confident. And that was the last piece Marcus needed. The admission that they could handle any reports suggested they were experienced at covering their tracks. This, combined with the abusive language and unlawful detention, was more than enough for a slam dunk case. He caught Ruiz's eye. She moved her hand in a subtle signal. Time was up. From the edge of the crowd, a sudden shift occurred. 4 figures emerged, 2 from each side of the street, moving swiftly but not running. They wore casual clothes but carried the quiet authority of law enforcement. Within seconds, they had surrounded the scene. One of them, a tall woman with a determined expression, stepped forward and flashed a badge. "FBI," she announced in a clear, calm voice. "Officers, step away from that man." A hush fell. Wheeler and Dawson froze. Shock and confusion flickered across their faces. Dawson's hand went to his radio, but he stopped himself. Wheeler tried to laugh it off. "FBI? Huh. What's the meaning of this?" The tall woman didn't flinch. "We've been monitoring you. We have live footage of everything that happened here." She nodded at Marcus. "Release him immediately." The crowd parted to give the newcomer space. Marcus's heart soared with relief. The cavalry had arrived. He focused on staying calm. He couldn't reveal himself as an agent just yet. Let them take control first. Wheeler raised his arms in mock surrender. "Live footage, really? We were just doing our job." He tried to muster confidence, but his voice wavered. One of the other FBI agents, a man with a trimmed beard, stepped closer. "We've documented your harassment, racial insults, and illegal detainment. Don't make this harder on yourselves." Dawson's face went pale. He glanced at Wheeler, silently pleading for a way out. Wheeler's bravado cracked. He reached for a pocket knife to cut the ties. Anything to appear cooperative. With shaking hands, he sliced through the plastic restraints binding Marcus. As soon as Marcus was free, the bearded FBI agent gently moved him aside, out of the officer's reach. Ruiz stepped forward now, removing her sunglasses. "Officers, place your hands behind your heads," she said quietly. Wheeler's eyes widened. He recognized the no-nonsense tone, the finality in her voice. Dawson opened his mouth as if to protest, but a glare from Ruiz silenced him. They complied, their earlier swagger reduced to trembling compliance. The crowd, at first stunned, began cheering. The phones kept recording, but now the tables had turned. Instead of humiliation for Marcus, the spectacle focused on the officers facing consequences. The onlookers pressed closer, calling out, "Justice," and "About time." Someone shouted, "I got all of it on video, FBI." Another chimed in, "Thank you for stepping in." Marcus rubbed his sore wrists. He wanted nothing more than to let out a sigh of relief, but he knew the procedure. He maintained a neutral stance, his role as a victim still intact in public eyes. Ruiz approached him quietly, leaning in so only he could hear, "Good work. We got them." He gave a barely perceptible nod. It wasn't the time or place to reveal his true identity to the crowd. For now, he was just the man who had been tied up for no reason. Later, in a secure environment, he filed the final reports. The camera in his shirt had done its job, capturing every second. The FBI agents led Wheeler and Dawson away, reading them their rights. The officers looked dazed, as if caught in their worst nightmare. Their smug expressions had vanished, replaced by hollow stares of disbelief. The entire scene had flipped in a matter of minutes. As the crowd parted for the agents, people approached Marcus with concern. A young woman with a headscarf offered him a bottle of water. "Here, you must be thirsty." Marcus accepted the water gratefully. "Thank you," he said, voice sincere. He appreciated their kindness. They hadn't saved him from the pole on their own, but their presence, their outrage, had mattered. It confirmed that not everyone was willing to stand by silently. The crowd continued buzzing with excitement and relief. Some people called friends, describing what they'd just witnessed. Others checked their recordings, eager to share the story online. Marcus knew that within hours, this incident would spread widely. Public pressure would combine with the FBI's evidence, ensuring these corrupt officers would face justice. As Ruiz and the team guided Wheeler and Dawson into an unmarked car, Marcus stepped away with another agent who posed as a sympathetic officer from a different precinct. The agent quietly told him, "We'll get you medical attention and take your statement." That was brave. Marcus nodded, exhaustion replacing adrenaline. He thought back to the humiliation, the anger, and the tension he'd endured. It was worth it. The corrupt officers hadn't just slipped up, they'd all but confessed to their mindset in front of a live audience. He followed the undercover agent away from the crowd. Behind him, curious voices and cheering still filled the air. Ahead lay the future resolution of this case, a process he would see through to its rightful conclusion. In a borrowed conference room inside a temporary FBI field office, Marcus sat at a small table and stretched his sore arms. He had been freed less than an hour ago, but the memory of those plastic ties still lingered like phantom pressure. Across from him, Supervisor Janet Ruiz watched quietly, arms folded. The hum of an air conditioner and the distant ring of telephones formed a soft backdrop. There were no windows, just sterile walls and a single overhead light. It was a far cry from the tense street scene he had just escaped. Ruiz broke the silence. "The two officers are in custody, being processed down the hall." She leaned against the table. "We've got everything on record. The district attorney's office has been notified." Marcus nodded. He understood the procedure: statements, evidence review, and likely a media storm once the news spread. Those crooked cops had boasted as if they were untouchable. Now FBI surveillance and public cell phone footage had boxed them in with no escape. But Marcus knew that, in these cases, pushback often came from unexpected places: lawyers, union reps, even colleagues sympathetic to the accused. He had to stay focused. The door opened again, and a man in a dark suit entered, introducing himself as Special Prosecutor David Lynn. He carried a slim folder and exuded calm efficiency. "We've got them in separate rooms," he said to Ruiz, then glanced at Marcus with a respectful nod. "We'll try to get a formal statement from you soon. For now, we're working with the footage and preparing initial charges." Lynn set down the folder. "We have Officer Wheeler's and Officer Dawson's basic records. Complaints, inquiries, nothing ever stuck, but they've been on internal affairs radar. Today's events give us what we need." Marcus rolled his shoulders, still feeling the day's tension. "They might try to claim it was a misunderstanding," he said, knowing how often abusers twist the narrative. "Or say they suspected me of a crime." Ruiz nodded grim. "They'll have to explain the racist remarks and the physical restraint without cause. Hard to spin that." Lynn agreed. "We have clear audiovisual evidence, and it's compelling. Still, I won't underestimate their defense." Their attorney just arrived. A sour taste formed in Marcus's mouth. Of course, they'd have legal counsel instantly. That was their right, but he despised the idea of anyone trying to excuse what those officers did. As if on cue, another agent poked his head through the door. "The defense lawyer is asking for a meeting with the prosecutors," he said, sounding annoyed. Lin sighed. "I'll see what they want," he said, heading for the door. "Keep me posted, Ruiz." When the prosecutor left, Ruiz turned to Marcus. "We'll let Lin handle that. In the meantime, you should know that your camera feed was flawless. Headquarters is pleased. They're discussing how this can open the door to investigating if there are more officers involved." Marcus's jaw tightened. "You think Wheeler and Dawson had accomplices?" Ruiz shrugged. "They weren't shy about their behavior. It's possible they did this before with others, or that someone higher up allowed it. Today's footage might encourage more victims to come forward." That brought Marcus a small measure of satisfaction. If exposing these two meant a larger cleanup, so be it. He drained the rest of his water and tried to relax. It was nearly impossible after the ordeal, but he knew the fight wasn't over. A few minutes passed before Lin returned, his expression neutral. "Their lawyer claims the officers acted on suspicion of trespassing and attempted theft," he said dryly. "Total nonsense, but we saw it coming." Ruiz snorted. "Did they mention why they tied him to a pole and humiliated him in front of bystanders?" Lin gave a humorless smile. "That's where their story falls apart." The lawyer hinted at stress. Poor judgment, even tried to suggest the presence of a crowd influenced their actions. "None of it justifies what we saw. We'll hold firm." Marcus listened silently. He was grateful for the support, but he also knew legal battles could get messy. "Are we bringing me in as a witness today?" he asked. Lin shook his head. "Not yet. Let's let their own words sink them first. We'll use your testimony after we've gotten more out of them." Ruiz nodded and picked up a tablet from the table. "We have real-time audio from the interrogation room. Let's listen in for a moment." She tapped the screen, and a muffled feed crackled to life, capturing voices from the next room. Officer Wheeler's voice emerged, sounding frustrated and defensive. "We didn't know who he was. He looked suspicious. We were doing our job." His tone lacked the cocky arrogance Marcus remembered from the street. Then came Dawson's voice, quieter but anxious. "Come on, we never hurt him. He was resisting, right? Isn't that what we say?" Marcus rolled his eyes at that. So now Dawson wanted to rewrite the scene. He glanced at Ruiz. She pressed her lips into a tight line. The FBI had the raw footage. No resisting had occurred. The agents had watched everything live. Ruiz turned off the audio feed, shaking her head. "Let them squirm. The recorded evidence is stronger than any excuse they can come up with." Marcus decided to address something bothering him. "What's the next step for me personally? Should I stay under wraps as a victim, or do we reveal I'm FBI?" Ruiz considered this. "We might keep your status low-key for now. The public knows a man was abused. We haven't announced you're an agent. If that comes out, the defense might try to spin it as entrapment. We have enough on them without complicating the narrative." He understood. Sometimes the simplest public story is the best. A victim, recorded cruelty, and swift justice. No need to mention the undercover angle unless necessary. Lin checked his watch. "I'll head back to the interrogation. We're prepping formal charges." Just then, the door swung open. Another agent entered, Caroline Morris, an analyst Marcus recognized. She looked uneasy. "We got a situation," she said, holding up her phone. Footage from the scene is spreading fast online. A few local pundits are already framing it as a heroic intervention by the FBI, but others are questioning why we didn't step in sooner. Marcus sighed. There would always be critics. "We had to document the crime properly," he said. "Without evidence, they'd walk free." Ruiz put a hand on his shoulder. "Don't worry about the chatter. Our priority is the case. The truth is on our side, and we can explain our methods later if needed." Morris nodded and continued. "Also, the police department's public relations office has issued a brief statement saying they're cooperating with the FBI and that these two officers don't represent the force. They're trying to distance themselves." "Let them," Ruiz said with a shrug. "They should have cleaned up their own mess long ago." She turned to Marcus. "At least the department isn't defending them publicly. That's a step in the right direction." Marcus was silent, imagining how many victims never got justice. Today would change that, at least in this city. He stood and paced a few steps. The soreness was less intense now. "What about the witnesses who were on the street? Are we talking to them?" Ruiz nodded. "We have agents interviewing several who stayed behind. They'll confirm what happened. The media coverage plus eyewitness statements will make this airtight." Morris cleared her throat. "One more thing. I've flagged a few social media accounts that appear sympathetic to the officers, claiming the video doesn't show what happened before they approached you. We know it's nonsense, but just be aware. We might face misinformation." "Typical," Marcus said, shaking his head. Let them try. We got the full tape from the start. The door opened again. This time Lin walked back in. He looked satisfied. They've lawyered up completely now, refusing to say anything else. We're moving forward with charges. The DA wants them arraigned by tomorrow. Ruse looked relieved. Good. Marcus can provide a statement this afternoon. Lin agreed. Yes, let's get that done. He paused, meeting Marcus's eyes with respect. You're the key witness. After we charge them, I recommend you take a few days off. Let the legal machine grind. We've got everything we need. A small smile tugged at Marcus's lips. Some rests sounded great. He wanted a hot shower, a change of clothes, and a chance to process everything. I'll stick around for the statement. Ruse stepped forward, placing a file in front of Marcus. This has the official form. Just detail your perspective of today's events. Keep it factual. We have all the emotional proof on video. A knock on the door interrupted the soft hush of the room. Another agent entered with a nod to Ruse. We got positive IDs on 3 prior victims who filed complaints. They're willing to talk to us now that they see something is being done. Ruiz's eyes widened slightly. That's excellent. This could help build a broader indictment. Lin checked his watch again. We should arrange those interviews as soon as possible, maybe even today. The more patterns we show, the stronger the case. Marcus finished signing his statement and handed it to Ruiz. Here you go. She took it, scanning the page quickly. Perfect. Clear and concise. She looked genuinely proud. Marcus stood, feeling lighter now that the paperwork was done. Thanks. He gathered himself. Though he'd remained discreet, he looked forward to eventually stepping back into normal life, free from this undercover identity. As he left the room, guided by another agent toward a quieter hallway, he passed by one of the interrogation rooms. He didn't stop or linger, no need to exchange glances with the 2 officers who had tried to degrade him. Their fate was now in the hands of prosecutors and the weight of undeniable evidence. In that moment, Marcus allowed himself a small, private moment of satisfaction. By the next morning, the FBI's temporary field office buzzed with a new energy. Agents hurried between rooms, carrying folders and laptops. The entire operation had grown beyond 2 rogue officers. The swift arrest and viral footage were prompting a broader investigation. Marcus sat in a break area nursing a cup of coffee. He wore a fresh shirt and jeans, no hidden camera this time, and tried to absorb how quickly things were changing. Lin, the special prosecutor, arrived carrying a stack of printouts. He greeted Marcus with a respectful nod before turning to Supervisor Ruiz, who stood by a corkboard pinned with photographs and timelines. Overnight, 3 more victims had formally come forward, each telling stories that mirrored Marcus's experience. Now that they saw swift action being taken, they dared to speak up. Statements were pouring in. This is getting bigger, Lin said, placing the papers on a desk. We now have 5 separate victims who confirm a pattern. The DA wants to consolidate the charges and potentially add a conspiracy count if we can prove the officers coordinated their behavior over time. Ruiz tapped a photo of the arrested officers, Wheeler and Dawson. What about any links to their fellow officers? Are we seeing a network? Still sorting through that, Lin said. Internal Affairs is suddenly very cooperative. A few detectives from the local PD came in this morning with disciplinary files that paint a rough picture. Apparently, Wheeler and Dawson bragged about their conduct to colleagues, some of whom may have turned a blind eye. Marcus, listening from the side, felt a tightness in his chest. He knew systemic problems rarely stopped at 1 or 2 people. Do we know if their superiors ever got wind of this? Rude shook her head, not confirmed yet. The department's brass claims ignorance, but we'll keep digging. If anyone higher up knew and stayed silent, we'll find out. Outside the hallway, a gentle knock preceded the entrance of Caroline Morris, the analyst who had tracked social media responses the previous day. She carried a thin tablet, her face serious. We've got a new twist, she said. A city council member is calling for a special hearing. She wants answers from both the police department and the FBI. Seems like she's seeking political points, but it could help us shed more light. Lin exhaled slowly. A hearing means media frenzy, but also an opportunity to present hard facts. Could force the department to be more transparent. Marcus remembered the crowd that had formed around him when he was tied to the pole. The public's outcry had been genuine. A public hearing might keep the momentum toward accountability alive. If this hearing happens, do we testify? He asked quietly. Rude studied him, considering the risks of revealing his undercover role publicly. We'll see. We might rely on the video evidence and victim statements first. Your identity as an FBI agent doesn't have to come out. You did your job, and we got more than enough without complicating the narrative." Marcus accepted that with a small nod. He wasn't eager to become a public figure in this case. He had done what was needed. Now the system could carry the torch. Not long after, another door creaked open. An older black man with silver hair and kind, tired eyes stepped inside, escorted by an agent. "This is Mr. Gaines," the agent said softly, "one of the victims from last year's incident." Lynn walked over, hand extended. "Mr. Gaines, thank you for coming. We appreciate your courage." Gaines gave a polite handshake but looked uneasy. "I never thought I'd step foot in a federal office for this," he said. "Last time I reported something, I got told to drop it. But after seeing that video on the news yesterday, I knew I had to try again." Marcus remembered the footage making headlines, images of him tied to a pole, eyes filled with confusion and anger. That stark visual had rattled the community. Now it was galvanizing people like Gaines. Marcus couldn't help feeling grateful for that unfortunate moment. It had achieved what countless formal complaints never did: undeniable evidence. Gaines took a seat and began to describe his experience. Wheeler and Dawson had confronted him near a bus stop, accused him of loitering, and shoved him against a wall. No one helped, and his initial complaint went nowhere. Now, with the FBI involved, he hoped his account would finally matter. As Gaines spoke, Marcus watched silently. Each detail matched the pattern: random harassment and casual cruelty. The room felt charged with quiet determination. Agents took notes, and Lynn asked careful, respectful questions. Ruse stood by, arms crossed, focused on every word. No one doubted Gaines now. When the interview ended, Ruse walked Gaines to the door. "Thank you," she said, her voice sincere. "Your testimony helps build a stronger case." Gaines nodded. Glad someone's listening this time. He left with a quiet dignity that touched Marcus deeply. Here was a man who had been wronged and ignored, now finally heard. After Gaines departed, Lynn rubbed his forehead. "We've got enough for multiple charges: hate crime enhancements, assault under color of authority, unlawful restraint, and now a pattern of misconduct. The DA is going to have a field day." He flipped through his notes. "I'll push for an early trial date. The defense will try delaying tactics, but public pressure is high." Morris approached Marcus with a printout, a transcript of a social media livestream from the scene. "Thought you'd want to see how people reacted," she said softly. "You were in the thick of it, but now you can understand the impact." Marcus scanned the transcript. It showed a flood of comments: anger, sympathy, disbelief. People were outraged and demanding justice, praising the FBI for stepping in. Some commenters recognized the need for a deeper investigation into the department's culture. Marcus handed the paper back to Morris. "It's overwhelming, but I'm glad it's shifting public opinion." Just then, another agent announced from the doorway, "We got a call from the police union's representative. They want to meet with the FBI to discuss the arrests." Ruse exchanged a glance with Lynn. No surprise, they'll probably try to downplay this, claim it's just two bad apples. Lynn shrugged. "We have a duty to listen. Might glean something useful, or at least make it clear we're not backing down." He motioned to Ruse. "We'll handle it. Marcus, you can sit this one out." Marcus didn't argue. He was relieved not to face another tense confrontation today. Instead, he settled back into the break area, finishing his coffee as Ruse and Lynn exited. That was the heart of it. Marcus realized the incident wasn't just about Wheeler and Dawson. It was about a system that allowed them to operate. And now, one courageous act, his silent camera, was lifting a heavy lid off that system. He took some comfort in that. After some time, Ruse and Lynn returned. Ruse's eyes met Marcus's. "They tried their best to minimize it," she said, referring to the police union meeting. "But we showed them we're holding firm. No deals or quiet settlements. The evidence is too strong." Lynn added, "And with the city council hearing coming up, they know the public won't accept a cover-up." Morris glanced at Marcus. "The public is curious about the victim's identity. They know about the footage, but not who you really are. The internet is buzzing with theories." Marcus stiffened slightly. He'd remain just the victim to the world, but that anonymity wouldn't last forever, especially if he was needed to testify. He looked at Ruse, who offered a supportive nod. "I know you said we might keep it simple," Marcus said carefully. "But if the council hearing demands transparency, maybe I should tell my story fully as who I am." Lynn and Ruse exchanged looks. The idea carried risks. Once revealed as FBI, defense lawyers might cry entrapment. But then again, the evidence was overwhelming. and public trust might deepen if they saw an agent stepping forward to confirm the truth, not just as an enforcer, but as a person who endured abuse firsthand. Ruiz took a breath. It's a serious decision, but considering how the investigation is unfolding, dozens of victims, a public outcry, a council hearing, it might be beneficial. Your revelation could reinforce that we're not playing games. We had to go undercover because the system failed people. Lynn nodded slowly. It could strengthen the moral argument, show that we believed so strongly in catching them that we risked one of our own. Just be sure you're ready for the spotlight, Marcus. Ruiz offered a tight smile. We'll coordinate before the council hearing. For now, focus on resting. We still have days to prepare and weigh all the angles. Lynn packed up his papers, concluding, this case is unfolding rapidly. Let's make sure every step counts. Morris stood and stretched. The world is watching. Whatever we do next, let's do it right. Marcus rose from his chair and walked toward a window at the far end of the corridor. He gazed out over the city's rooftops, soaking in the sunlight. Yesterday, he had been just another face on a busy street, silently capturing injustice. Today, the case had grown into a catalyst for change. Tomorrow, he might be the face of that change, stepping forward as both victim and agent. The old municipal chamber was packed from wall to wall. Rows of wooden benches were filled with citizens, journalists, community leaders, and activists. The steady hum of murmured anticipation hovered in the air. This city council hearing had become the event everyone talked about, driven by the recent scandal involving 2 rogue officers who had humiliated a black man in broad daylight, footage that had gone viral and sparked outrage. Only a handful of people knew that the victim in that footage was, in fact, an undercover FBI agent. At the front of the chamber, a long table held the mayor and several council members. Their faces were stern, as if bracing for a storm. On one side of the chamber sat representatives from the police department, looking stiff and uneasy. On the other side were Supervisor Janet Ruiz, Special Prosecutor David Lynn, and a few FBI agents who had worked this case from the shadows. Next to them, flanked by their lawyer, sat Officers Wheeler and Dawson. The men captured on camera abusing their power. They had been suspended and questioned, but until this hearing, the full truth had not been laid bare. They appeared tense yet defiant, believing their lawyers' assurances that this might still blow over. Marcus Avery waited in a small side room, his heart steady but focused. This was it, the moment he would step forward, reveal his role, and ensure no escape for the corrupt officers. Over the past week, the FBI had gathered overwhelming evidence, victim testimonies, internal documents, and the original footage from Marcus's hidden camera. The public knew the FBI had intervened, but no one outside a select few knew the victim tied to that pole was actually an agent gathering undeniable proof. Inside the main chamber, the mayor tapped the microphone. This hearing is called to order. We're here to address allegations of police misconduct and to understand the FBI's findings in this case. Lynn stood first, speaking with calm authority. He outlined the core facts: 2 officers accused of repeatedly targeting and humiliating citizens, especially people of color. He mentioned numerous victims who had come forward, bolstered by a remarkable piece of video evidence. The council members listened intently. The audience sat silent, phones ready to record every word. One council member adjusted her glasses, leaning forward. "Mr. Lynn, we've seen that footage. It's disturbing. The public wants to know, how did the FBI get such close-up evidence?" Lynn glanced at Ruiz, who took her cue. Standing tall, she replied, "We embedded an undercover agent in the environment where these abuses were rumored to occur. The agent recorded the event as it happened." This caused a ripple of surprise. Everyone had assumed the footage came from a bystander's phone. Wheeler and Dawson exchanged nervous looks. The lawyer beside them frowned, whispering frantically into their ears. The mayor pressed, "You're saying the victim on that tape was actually an FBI operative?" Ruiz's voice was clear. "Yes. We had received numerous complaints that went nowhere. Our undercover agent placed himself at risk to obtain irrefutable proof. The man you saw tied to the pole was working with us." An uneasy murmur spread through the crowd. The officer's lawyer stood, raising a hand. Objection, or rather a request for clarification. "Are you implying entrapment? Did your agent provoke my clients?" Ruiz shook her head. "Our agent did nothing but walk down the street. Your clients chose to target him based solely on their biases." The mayor frowned. "If the victim was an FBI agent, can we hear from him directly?" Ruiz nodded and turned to the side door. Marcus stepped out, wearing a simple suit. As he approached the front, a hush fell. Marcus's face was familiar, captured in that infamous video where he'd been tied to a pole. Journalists and onlookers recognized him immediately, gasping softly. Wheeler and Dawson stiffened, their eyes wide. They had expected a fearful victim, not an FBI operative about to testify. "Good afternoon," Marcus said, voice steady. "My name is Marcus Avery. I'm a special agent with the FBI." A stunned silence gripped the room. Even the council members looked startled. Cameras flashed. People leaned forward, hanging on every word. "I was the individual unlawfully detained and humiliated by officers Wheeler and Dawson," Marcus continued. "I posed as a regular citizen because previous complaints against these officers were ignored or dismissed. We needed undeniable evidence of their misconduct and prejudice." Wheeler's jaw dropped. Dawson's face paled. Their lawyer whispered urgently, but nothing could undo this bombshell. They had tied an FBI agent to a pole, mocked his race, and left him for public display. Now he stood, calm and factual, turning their defense strategy into dust. The lawyer cleared his throat and stood up. "This is outrageous. Entrapment, there must be entrapment here." Marcus fixed the lawyer with a steady gaze. "I neither provoked nor resisted them. I complied with their every order. They singled me out due to my appearance and humiliated me in public. That's not entrapment. That's them exposing their own cruelty." The lawyer tried again. "My clients had reason to believe." Lynn cut him off. "We have the footage. We have multiple victims. Your clients joked about certain types and teaching lessons. There's no reason that justifies hate-fueled misconduct." Murmurs of approval rippled through the audience. Council members whispered among themselves, some nodding grimly. A council member addressed Marcus. "Agent Avery, you risked a lot. Why reveal yourself now?" Marcus took a moment before answering. "Because people deserve to know how far we had to go to prove these crimes. Honest citizens complained for years with no result. It took an undercover FBI agent becoming a victim to finally force accountability. I reveal myself now so the community understands we're serious about reform, not just quick fixes." The tension in the chamber reached a peak. The mayor looked to the police representatives. "You have heard this testimony. How do you respond?" A senior police official stood, voice shaky. "We condemn these actions. If officers Wheeler and Dawson did what's alleged, they will face full consequences." Wheeler snapped out of his shock, suddenly standing up, face flushed. "This is a setup," he shouted. "We were doing our job. How were we supposed to know he was FBI?" Dawson, panicking, echoed his partner. "We didn't know." He looked suspicious. "This isn't fair." The council and audience reacted with disbelief. Their outburst only confirmed their lack of remorse. Marcus stayed silent, letting them dig their own graves. Their lawyer tried pulling them down to their seats, hissing at them to stay quiet. Lynn turned to the council. "Your honors, based on Agent Avery's testimony and the overwhelming evidence, we've coordinated with the district attorney's office." He gave a small nod to a uniformed officer standing quietly at the back, an internal affairs lieutenant who had been waiting for this signal. The lieutenant stepped forward, producing a pair of handcuffs. "Officers Wheeler and Dawson," he announced, voice steady, "we have new warrants for your arrest on additional charges, including hate crime enhancements and conspiracy. Your bail is revoked. You are now in custody." Gasps and cheers erupted. The officers froze, eyes wide. They had come here hoping to escape with minimal damage, maybe a suspension. Instead, they were being arrested on the spot. Cameras flashed wildly, reporters clamoring to capture the moment. "Wait, you can't do this," Wheeler barked, trying to step back. Dawson shook his head, stunned. But it was useless. The lieutenant and another officer quickly secured their wrists with cuffs. The lawyer sputtered protests, but no one listened. The evidence was too damning. The mayor tapped the microphone for order. "We will reconvene shortly to discuss broader reforms. For now, these arrests conclude this part of the hearing. Let it be known that this council will not tolerate such abuses." The chamber buzzed with excitement and relief. As Wheeler and Dawson were led away, Marcus stepped back, meeting Ruse's eyes. She offered a proud nod. Lynn appeared beside them, face lit with satisfaction. Morris hovered nearby, recording the scene for official documentation. Marcus felt a weight lift from his chest. His undercover role had been a last resort, a painful gamble. But the outcome was clear. The officers who had terrorized innocent people were now handcuffed, exposed before the entire community. Their shocked faces proved they never expected to be held accountable. The law had caught them at last. Ruse placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "You were brilliant," she said quietly. "Your testimony left no doubt. Their reaction sealed the deal. Marcus managed a small smile. "I'm just glad it's over. Now the city can start healing. The victims who spoke up will see that their voices count." Lynn joined them. "This will likely prompt more investigations, deeper reforms. The council will propose new oversight measures. The department can't hide behind excuses anymore." They made their way toward the exit, passing reporters who tried to shout questions. Ruse shielded Marcus with a raised hand. He didn't need to say more. The footage, his testimony, and the officer's fresh arrest spoke volumes. Outside, the afternoon sun felt warm and reassuring on Marcus's face. He took a deep breath. The city would not change overnight, but today it took a bold step toward accountability. He had helped crack open the door to that future. As they descended the stone steps, people in the crowd recognized him and applauded softly. A few chanted, "Thank you." Marcus dipped his head in acknowledgement. He wasn't a hero, he was an agent doing his duty. But if his actions inspired trust and courage in others, then he had done something worthwhile. He walked on, side by side with Ruse and Lynn, knowing that the final arrest had been made in full public view after the truth came out. Nothing could erase what had happened, but at least now, justice would run its course.